Well, my first question, Diane, if I might throw to you, that National Low Income Housing Coalition is currently working on a sweeping initiative that I understand is called Housed, focusing on housing as a human right, as a civil right. Can you tell us more about that initiative, and how did you land on that particular focus, given all of the other housing advocacy work that you've done and NLIHC has led over the years?
Sure, glad to. Thanks for the question and thanks for having me. So the Housed campaign is our national campaign for universal, stable, affordable housing. And the policies that we are advancing and looking to enact aren't new. These solutions aren't new. These are the same solutions that many of us have been pushing for years and in some cases decades. What's new is the tremendous opportunity that we have right now, this moment in time, which really is at least a once in a generation. I think it's more likely a once in a lifetime opportunity to get the level of investments that we need to end homelessness and end housing poverty in our country. So the campaign is also about building on the momentum that we've created over the last many years and decades, really, and especially over the last year during COVID, where at the National Income Housing Coalition, we mobilized our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition to respond to the impacts of COVID on renters and people experiencing homelessness. And that network is well over 2,300 organizations. We had some real success over the last year in terms of getting unprecedented resources for emergency rental assistance, eviction protections, and others. And now we want to keep that momentum going, keep that movement moving towards the long-term solutions that are needed to ensure that we don't get to the brink of an eviction tsunami in the next pandemic or even just in the next year. So we're working on advancing 4 sets of solutions that taken together could end homelessness and housing poverty in our country. The first is to expand rental assistance to all eligible households. Currently only 1 in 4 households who are eligible for and need housing assistance gets any. That should be 4 out of 4. So we need universal housing assistance, and that is something that the president has committed to achieving. We also need to build more apartments, and we need to make them affordable to the lowest income people. So we're pushing for an allocation of at least $45 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund. We need to preserve the affordable housing that we already have in our country, especially public housing. So we need $70 billion for that. We're also pushing for a permanent emergency rental assistance program, what we're calling a National Housing Stabilization Fund. So cash assistance to help people absorb a financial shock and stay housed. And then finally, we need a whole set of solutions to rebalance the power that currently tilts so heavily in favor of landlords and at the expense of renters. So we're pushing for a whole set of robust renter protections like just cause evictions and expunging eviction records and right to counsel. And what's exciting about this moment is that, for many of us who've been working on this for years or decades, this is the moment we've been waiting for, where we have this window of opportunity, Congress and the White House working on a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package, some general agreement, especially among the Democrats, that housing is infrastructure, and the president proposing $318 billion in housing investments. So now the work we have before us is to get that enacted, and first to make sure that those resources are targeted towards those with the greatest needs. And that's the work of the Housed campaign.
Great, thank you for that. And I want to thank Joyce Smith for her note in the chat about the importance of more subsidies to make real affordable housing possible. And I do want to encourage all the participants, if you have questions as we go out, put them in the chat. We may take them as we talk. We may do some at the end, but feel free to throw them in the chat whenever you have them. Jacqueline, I want to ask you, Enterprise Communities is recognized as a leader in its work as an intermediary, as a funder, as a provider of technical assistance in supporting communities across the country addressing neighborhood revitalization, particularly around housing. How is what you and your colleagues are actually seeing unfold in neighborhoods on the ground, how is that influencing the policy advocacy that you do for national and local policy change?
Well, thank you. Excited to be here. And I always echo what Diane has to say. So very good comments to kick us off here about focusing on people's needs. And so, like you said, what happens in neighborhoods we serve doesn't just influence what we do around advocacy. It starts there. And, we've been at this for 40 years, listening firsthand to community development corporations and housing providers across the country. And not only that, but in the housing that we own, in our own rental housing, we have 22,000 people that we get to hear firsthand from their lived experience on what they need to be successful. And so what I'm seeing at this point in the country is we're at an unprecedented time. And that means that we need unprecedented change to make change to actually support people in a better way. And the door is open under the current administration. And so I suggest we push. We know before COVID-19 transpired, we had 11 million families that were paying more than 50% of their rent. And when you think about it in terms of the impact to particular communities, Black people and Latinx people are disproportionately harmed by housing affordability, including single moms. And so right now across the country, people are more aware than ever that housing is directly connected to racial justice, climate justice, economic justice, and health justice. And they know that investing in housing means that we can progress on all of these things. So I say we're in post-George Floyd America, and that we need to move from talking about racial equity solutions to acting on them. So shout out to Alderman Simmons for the great work that she's been doing in Evanston and looking at how we can address systemic issues that's been in place for decades. I also, like Diane shared, is we've been fighting for rental assistance and making sure that the resources are trying to make its way through the pipeline to owners. And it's important that we continue to fight for eviction moratorium, and especially for those that are temporarily unemployed. And as they get back to work, they need to lean on some support. And what's happening at the federal level right now is so important. And we are talking about historic events in housing, like housing infrastructure, as Diane mentioned, and proven programs that can help us accomplish all of these goals. So I want to just see more of supportive vouchers, more expansion of housing credits. We co-lead the action campaign that has roughly 2,400 groups connected to it. And also just to look at how we can expand appropriations for HUD and USDA rural housing programs. So I'm saying we need all of the above type of solutions for Americans that are really vulnerable to displacement and potentially experiencing homelessness.
Thank you. And I love this theme of windows and doors. And I really want to come back to it because I think there's real important strategic questions about those windows and doors and how they swing open and closed. But before I do, I want to bring Robin into this conversation. You helped spearhead the nation's very first legislation around reparations for African Americans in your community in Evanston and tied that to real dollars, an estimated $10 million. Now, I don't know a lot about Evanston, so tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I had not thought of it as a particular hotbed for racial equity in the past, but maybe it's becoming so now, thanks to your leadership. Can you talk about, like, what was the moment, the watershed moment that got people to take what you were proposing seriously, your fellow legislators and the general public?
Thank you for the question. And I would say, like many other cities, not so much that we were a hotbed for racial equity and justice, but we were doing all of the ceremonial type work, had many committees and commissions and appointments and days in recognition of and proclamations and resolutions without any funding. And my leadership style has always been solutions only. I love that I keep hearing solutions in this dialogue this morning. It feels like this is my place to be in. And I thought that we would actually do something tangible and measurable. And so when I made the introduction to my colleagues on City Council, it was important that I did it with the voice of the community so that it wasn't political, it wasn't my agenda alone, that it was the community at large, very importantly, the stakeholders and other partners and leaders that were ready for reparative justice and reparations in a tangible way, not another, proclamation day honoring, Black lives, or, another street naming, not another ceremony. And what I did was I took our existing data. We didn't need any more data. We didn't need a feasibility. We didn't need to know any more about our history rooted in anti-Blackness. We're not unique. We have anti-Black housing policy, zoning laws. It's baked into our current legislation. And so what I did was simply took the information that we had and partnered it with all the goals and things that we said that we valued through proclamation and resolution, and introduced reparations simply as an action plan. I didn't introduce it as this isn't a moral argument. This isn't anything other than here is an action plan for us to make good on the years of commitments and values to racial equity in the Black community and our injustices. And so it was not difficult. It was a very thoughtful and smart. As an entrepreneur, I really look at things from a specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, a timely plan. And we introduced it. It was embraced overwhelmingly by the community and the city council. There was really no way to deny that this was an appropriate, actionable, and measurable way for us to reach our goals for racial equity. In our city, we have a predominantly white, predominantly affluent community, about 66% white, Black community on a decline. Some of us call it an exodus. We're down to 16% of the population when we had been in the 20s, mid-20s before. We have a household income divide of $46,000 between Black and white Evanston. We have a life expectancy gap of 13 years. We have a home ownership gap, and it was on a decline. At that time in 2019, when I made this introduction, I was looking at our trajectory. Our Black community was leaving the city because of lack of affordability, lack of a sense of place, truly a sense of place, and lack of an opportunity for living wage jobs and have the same livability as our white friends and neighbors in the community. In addition to that, our homeownership rate had declined before to numbers less than before fair housing was passed. So we had to do something radically different. Anything to continue in the same vein and spirit and action for me had become an insult. It had become really a place of just mocking the goals of racial equity. And we had to do something as radical as all of the racial oppression that got us to this place of inequity. And reparations was a way to do that. I didn't know at that time that there hadn't been a local initiative yet. I was really thinking I was going to find a model at another city through my colleagues at National League of Cities. So it was a surprise to me that it hadn't been localized yet, as long as we've been talking about reparations since 1989 and when it was introduced HR 40 in Congress. I'm so excited to see now that our city has taken a first tangible step with dollars. It's $10 million. That fund has already grown because our community has bought in. Our partners have bought in. Residents, businesses, organizations in town have provided additional funding, some of them on a monthly basis. Others are preparing major gifts, learning more about the work. Others are looking to fund the work being developed. But our city has taken that first step. I couldn't be more proud, really encouraged to see that more cities are doing the same. Shout out to Asheville. I saw that they passed funding recently, I think in the last week. And so I hope that more cities that are taking that first step towards reparations with the resolution will follow up quickly with a funding commitment. And in our city, it was cannabis. It doesn't have to be cannabis. That actually was not my first idea. It was a graduated real estate transfer tax. But cannabis was an option for us. And I believe that we are in a season or era of repair in this nation. I'm going to embrace that and remain hopeful and continue collaborating and working with institutions and stakeholders that are ready for that change.
Thank you for that. That's amazing work. And it just reminds me, it just takes one person to be the first, right? The first to propose something big and bold, and others will see it and follow, and maybe even go a step further than you even thought to be big and bold to do. And that is the theme of this conference, and what I hope we're all getting ready to do, or are already doing. I want to come back to this kind of windows and doors thing. So I've been doing public interest advocacy and social justice advocacy for almost 30 years now. And I have found, I'm sure you all have found, that there's moments and those moments end. There's a political opportunity to take advantage of something, to get something done, to move something through, and then winds change, new people come into office, and sometimes those doors close. So I'm just curious for each of you just to reflect on, and I know it's impossible to predict, how long are these windows and doors open for us right now? What is it that we have to be doing differently during this period of time to not just propose big things, but actually get them done? And then maybe a third question, if you want to kind of respond to it, is what do we do when the window and door closes? When the opportunity seems to have passed us by, what does that moment mean? What should we be doing now to be prepared for that? Those are, I know, a lot of questions all at once. So you could just answer one of them, not all three.
Well, I can't bear to think about missing this window of opportunity. So I'm not willing to think ahead to what happens if we miss it, because we have to meet this moment and seize this opportunity. And there's I think what's really challenging for many people throughout the country who are eager to do something is that there's actually so much to do right now. And there are so many immediate, pressing, very urgent opportunities. So in the space where I am, in the housing and homelessness field, those include having unprecedented resources at the state and local level right now to respond to the needs that arose from COVID. So the $46.5 billion in emergency rental assistance, the $10 billion that's going to communities that could cut in half the number of people experiencing homelessness today, if it's used well, if it's used creatively. If it's used to acquire and convert hotels and motels and turn them into permanent supportive housing, that money is available now. And I think one of the challenges that we're hearing from our partners throughout the country is that, people are tired. It has been a rough year for so many obvious reasons, and many have been just rose to the occasion and been working so hard to manage our own personal lives during the pandemic, and then to try to keep people experiencing homelessness safe and healthy and alive, and avoid an eviction tsunami. And people are tired and a little bit burnt out, which is fair. And yet, when it comes to those resources, that window is going to close very soon. That emergency rental assistance has to be spent before the eviction moratorium expires. Hopefully we'll have at least another extension, but maybe not. Otherwise, we're going to see an historic wave of evictions across the country. That money for homelessness has to be spent now, especially when we look at this unique opportunity to purchase and convert hotels and motels, because that window is closing. The situation for hotels and motels and their willingness to sell is very different now than it was 6 months ago. It'll be different next week and the week after that. So we have to move on that opportunity. When it comes to the opportunity for potentially $300 billion in housing investments to end homelessness and end the housing poverty, if we get it right, that window is the next 6 to 9 months. And then it closes for I don't know how long, because again, we have a president in office who talks about housing as a human right, has committed to universal housing vouchers. We've never had a president who has made such a bold commitment to such an expansion of affordable housing. We have Democrats in Congress who are ready to go big and be bold with their majority. We have some bipartisan support for some of these essential housing investments. And we have this infrastructure spending package on the table. This is our moment, and we have to find a way to do it all, to be creative with the resources that are at the community level now, and to keep pushing our members of Congress to make sure we don't miss this moment.
Yeah, Well, first of all, Robin, Diane, you guys are my tribe. You're my people, just how you talk about the work. So we do have a fleeting moment related to housing and racial equity. But what I would go back to is something that Robin hit on. We're quick to use the data to point out the problems, but slow to use that information to drive solutions. We need to focus, focus, focus. So Robin took the opportunity of something happening in her community and saw that decrease in home ownership. The disparity has been long-standing, but took that to push a specific thing ahead and gave some focus to it. So focusing on vouchers, focusing on housing infrastructure, all those things are critical. The other thing I would say is that we got to play the long game here because the moment is fleeting. We need to address the systemic issues. Like we need to be wrapping stuff in. So when there is a pandemic or something comes along, there is vouchers for people that need them, right? 1 in 5 people are qualified. If we're going to have another pandemic, we're going to have other economic shocks and other things that impact people. It's about us approaching the system and really serving people differently and not waiting until some disaster comes about. And when we find people on our sidewalks and other things to start to make moves, which leads to my next point, which I raised earlier. Having lived expertise and having people of color and other people in leadership roles is critical importance so that we can keep the door open because we've been suffering for decades, centuries, and we must keep that conversation live. So having people like Alderwoman Simmons and other people in leadership roles keeps the conversation on point. And so having that lived experience at every single conversation, not after we create policies, but while we're creating them, so that we know that what we're shaping serves them and we're not bringing them up to the table with a folding chair after everything's been baked, and make sure that we keep them there the entire time. And so I would ask all of you to think about like, what could we be doing about systems so that we can prevent this? Because we're going to always have change in leadership at the federal level, but what could we do, like affirmatively furthering fair housing, led by racial equity, centered on low-income Americans' needs? And so I would just say that there's an opportunity of a lifetime here to infuse what we've learned through the pandemic and all the connections into the systems that we're all working with so that they work better for people.
And Jacqueline, thank you so much for adding the significance of lived experience being at the decision-making table. And that was when I ran for office, that was one of my primary concerns, that we had academics and longtime leaders that had not had the experience in which they were leading and defining policy and making budget decisions. And so lived experience means a lot. And in my case, having grew up in the ward that I serve, a historically segregated Black community, overcoming, low income and the barriers to accessing housing for my family. And, I was able to lead and be a voice for my neighbors from the experience that we were in that moment, and understanding that there are windows of opportunity, unfortunately, understanding that environmental matters may become more popular next than racial justice. And we should not have to fight amongst which of these causes is more important. But I do think that it's important that we all lead in a collaborative spirit, knowing that the need is so great. And especially with reparations, there's a debate about, should it be cash payment? Should it be programming? Should it be benefits? It should really be all of the above. There should be a portfolio of programs and services and compensation because the injuries are so great. We have everything from housing discrimination to over-policing to racial terror and police terror and income wage inequality and so on, environmental injustices. But we have to lead where we are in the capacity and within our purview. And that's what we did in the Evanston City Council, hoping that we would attract partners in our city to do their part. The school system's not in our purview. Law enforcement, they have a responsibility as well. Philanthropy can give in a way that empowers more than continues to sustain dependencies on subsidies and vouchers and things of that matter. So I think leading with urgency, one, we don't have time to wait until the next council or to the next leader is appointed or to the next budget discussion. We are in a state of emergency and have been for generations in our marginalized communities. So leading with urgency, leading in a collaborative way, and focusing in one area where we can make an impact. And I'm really proud that our city, through a community process, identified housing as an initial priority. I agree with that completely. I know that stable housing contributes to better classroom, performance and relationships and healthy neighborhoods. And it's the first way that any family, Black or white, is going to build wealth, usually. So I agree with that, but I think that leading with urgency, leading in a collaborative spirit, and focusing on one tangible first step and not being paralyzed in the discussion, and how do we redefine our equity issues, and how do we, come up with a new theory of this. It seems that there's a lot of discussion about, theory and not enough about application and solutions.
Yeah, can Beth, if you don't mind, can I chime in on something? So I've been at Enterprise for 16 years, and I just came into the role that I'm in over the past several months. And one of the first things we did, we rolled out a strategic plan, and then we're looking at data. We were listening to our partners across the country. Because of the pandemic, people that are housing folks had to do services, they had to provide PPE, go get meals, transportation, people are out of work. And we know that most people that live in affordable housing, HUD housing in particular, are mostly Black people. And we know that only, 2% of real estate firms are led by Black people. And more broadly, CDC is only 16%. So when you're looking for diversity and centering yourself on equity, it's important that you infuse resources and strategies into this group. And Enterprise has really been focused really on building housing. But how about, and we've been doing TA and capacity building, but we said we're going to focus on BIPOC-led groups in the community, right? And so we rolled out a $3.5 billion plan that's focused on BIPOC-led and for-profit by organizations across the country, and infusing resources into their infrastructure, into their leadership, so that they can get on their feet, so that they can respond to the community. Because I think a lot of what we've seen is that through the pandemic, we heard from folks, they didn't have what they needed. So giving focus, right? Focusing on those BIPOC-led groups, they've been saying it for a long time. They're paycheck to paycheck, they're in survival mode. And so addressing that with urgency. And then we do that work, but we are influencing other banks and institutions to come along with us. Change how you're operating, lower the bar, change things. Because if you don't have some great intention, you won't change anything in these systems and with some sense of urgency. So just wanted to chime in on ways that you get after that with greater intentionality.
And if I could just respond to that too, I so appreciate everything my co-panelists are saying here. And I think the capacity building piece, which I think nobody does better than Enterprise, frankly, throughout the country, is what is so important. And what I was talking about earlier, where, okay, there's all these opportunities now at the state and local level. Communities are struggling. They're struggling because they don't have the capacity. They're struggling because in many areas there aren't community-led organizations that can help influence both the design of programs like emergency rental assistance programs to make sure they're actually accessible to BIPOC people, to other marginalized communities. And then they don't have the capacity to be able to manage and run those programs. And as Jacqueline said, we'll face more disasters for sure. That's one certainty we have. And building up the capacity now, or even to think about if we're successful and we get this next infusion, huge infusion of funds from the federal government, if there aren't local organizations equipped to absorb those funds and put them to work, then we won't have succeeded. So having our eyes on both balls of, getting the additional resources, but actually working at the community level to build up the capacity and to focus on organizations led by people with lived expertise, I think is essential.
Well, I want to dig into that a little bit deeper, and also some of these intersections that Jacqueline and Robin talked about. So you mentioned intersections of housing with climate, with race, with education. I'm sure there's a million other things that we know that, the importance of housing in a lot of other ways. And then there's also this need for capacity, right? No one organization, no one government entity no one institution has a capacity to do what needs to be done at the level it needs to be done. So that kind of leads me to a question about coalitions, about coalition building, about working in partnership. Can you talk a little bit about how you have worked in coalition, outside of just our traditional housing, world? And can you give us any advice here in Philadelphia about how to better expand our coalition so we have that capacity, we have those that expertise, and we have those intersections?
Well, everything we do at the National Coalition, which is in our name, is coalition building and coalition leading and coalition participating. So we really believe in the importance of coalitions. Clearly, we can't do it on our own. I think one example that I would point to is something that can be replicated that I think has a lot of power is, especially in the housing field, I think for many, many years, we focused on kind of organizing ourselves and each other. And we had some limited success with that, but reached a point where, despite all of our best efforts, the problem was getting worse. And we clearly needed to do something differently. And Cushing Dolbear is the woman who founded the National Low Income Housing Coalition over 40 years ago. And she said long ago that housing is too important to be left to housers alone. And that's exactly right. It can't just be people who live and breathe and care deeply about affordable housing who are asking for more resources for affordable housing. We won't be successful that way. And it doesn't have to be just housers. It never did, but especially now there's such clear research and evidence that makes such a compelling case for how housing is central to so many other areas of our lives. And when we're affordably housed, our health improves, our kids' educational attainment improves, we earn more over our lifetimes, we even live longer depending on where we live. So we started a coalition called the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, where we reached out to leaders in other fields outside of housing to see if they were as convinced as we were that they weren't going to be successful in their goals of improving kids' health or improving kids' educational attainment or achieving racial justice until we got more people affordably and equitably and safely housed. And we asked the question and the answer was yes, they were convinced. And we formed the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. We now have a steering committee of 19 major organizations, only 4 of which have anything to do with affordable housing, have ever worked on affordable housing really in a focused way before. So there are groups like from the racial justice and civil rights field like NAACP and Unidos US. We have the National Education Association, largest teachers union in the country. We have groups like Community Catalyst that focus on healthcare, National League of Cities, National Association of Social Workers, a whole faith-based segment. These are organizations that have big networks of their own that they are now mobilizing to urge that we get more investments in affordable housing. And it's been incredibly effective because when we're talking to policymakers, we can have our avenues, we can have our champions on affordable housing. We need to talk to the people who aren't convinced yet. And sometimes we can't even get to them because housing is not one of their issues that they focus on. But for sure, they are focused on one of the other major issues: climate, racial justice, education, health. And now we have partners who can approach them from that place and help them see the link back to housing and homelessness and why we need these investments. So that's something that we've been working with partners at the national level, but we also have more focused efforts. We're up to about 15 states now where they are also building out these multi-sector coalitions focused on advancing affordable housing investments, and it's working. And I would encourage others to think about who are the partners that you don't have yet that can build some of the bridges that you need to get to where you're going.
Yeah. And as we're talking about doors and windows, I mean, all of us has been working. None of us has done anything solo. Like enterprise partners with Diane's group. I'm definitely going to be talking to Robin at greater depth about the work that she's done in Evanston. And I do feel like, I mentioned the action campaign has 2,400 organizations that largely house cities, counties, but it has other businesses. One approach to engaging other sectors is through boards, right? People always get people that are like-minded on their boards, but like housing boards, bringing in people that talk about economic mobility or that talk about climate resilience. And there's a way to bring people into the conversations at various levels. But as we did our strategic plan and we expressed really expanding on upward mobility ability and climate as climate resilience and people resilience, we realized the importance of having those partners. We've had them for many years, but going deeper. And I think what's exciting about this time now that makes it so right and good is that because of the pandemic, people could see the connections to race, housing, health more clearly. Like it was, it was esoteric for some folks. Like, what does housing have to do with these things? But when we start seeing more disasters across the country, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, and we saw what the pandemic did to people, we knew that people needed a roof over their head and clear housing and healthcare. It wakes up the conversation where people can see what they've been doing for years, how all this stuff is connected. And so if we talk about an equitable recovery and a path out of this, that could be a starting point there. What does recovery look like that includes the people that have been harmed the most by the pandemic and people that are on the fringes of becoming homeless? So I think that if I sat on a committee here in Los Angeles called the Greater LA Steering Committee, and it had like the head of the school board, a deputy mayor, someone that worked for a foundation, a houser, a healthcare provider. It had a mix of folks. And we came up with proposals that talked about like everyone should have access to internet. We need to not have anti-Black racism guiding what we're doing. It's something that I can share with you online through reading materials, but it was a coalition that came together around the pandemic, and they could elevate the things that were urgent and prioritize some things that we could all work on together to move Los Angeles forward. And I think Philadelphia could have that same opportunity. It's been beneficial, and we're executing on all of those recommendations slowly but surely.
And quickly, I can't add much. I just can affirm that the same sort of methodology or process was important for me in my work here in Evanston in introducing reparations. It took coalition. It took collaborative partnerships outside of government and outside of our city of Evanston, reaching into national leaderships, thought leaders, organizations, the Greek organizations, the interfaith community. Our allies have been a very important process in leadership in advancing our commitment to reparations. And as we continue the work and build out the funding and increase the programming, coalition building will continue to be a priority.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to turn to the questions that we have in the chat now for the last few minutes that we have. Tranda asked a question. Tranda, I hope you don't mind. I might slightly rephrase your question. She had asked about the challenge of median household income, affordable housing for people at the median household income, and affordable housing for people who really need it, who are very, very low income. Sometimes these kind of income limits don't always match up with the people that need the housing the most. How do we change that? How do we have national standards that maybe don't, or what do we do about national standards that maybe don't necessarily apply as effectively at the local level to reach the people most in need?
Well, I would just say Diane started off talking about housing vouchers. I'm gonna bring that back up again. That seems like clearly a point where you could serve the most vulnerable and those that are on the sliding scale that need. Right now, 1 in 5 people that are eligible for vouchers get them. If we expanded universal vouchers where everyone that got one that needed, and it had a sliding scale based on income, the person that's working at the grocery store would be okay. The person that's experiencing homelessness and needs housing and services would be okay. And the person that is on the fringe of coming out of, from low income to middle income would actually have the opportunity to remain stably housed. And so I think that's the biggest opportunity we have. And it also passes the power back to the people, not to the system. It gives them the choice and the power they need. And we need to make sure that there's rules that don't discriminate against people, and vouchers seem more like cash. But I really feel like that voucher system could address that, and where everybody that's in need would get some type of support.
I think we're so used to distributing our scarce resources rather than being bolder and saying resources for all. I think that's such an important point, Jacqueline. Thank you. Robin, were you about to jump in? So Paulette asked a question about housing infrastructure funding. Does it include dollars for improvements and renovations of existing units, especially senior housing? Because there are so many units that go offline or are not online because they need repairs to basic systems. Any thoughts on?
Sure. Well, the funding that's proposed, I mean, I'd say it's open. It's an open question right now because the negotiations and the writing of the bill language is still to come. What's been proposed by the president and by Chairwoman Maxine Waters, the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, who put together a bill, Housing as Infrastructure, is major investments in the low-income housing tax credit program, the National Housing Trust Fund, Home Investments Partnership Program, among other things. All of those resources can be used to create or preserve more housing for many populations who are extremely low or very low income, including seniors, including people with disabilities, including Native American populations on or off tribal lands, including people who are chronically homeless or families who are homeless. So the beauty of those programs is that they're targeted by income. So they ensure that resources are going towards those with the greatest needs, especially the National Housing Trust Fund program that's the most deeply targeted to people who are at 30% or below area median income. But beyond that, there's a lot of discretion for the local community to decide where are the greatest needs for how that we can meet with these resources. And the other good thing about the moment that we're in and what's being proposed is that the scale of the resources being proposed, if we were to achieve them, we wouldn't have to have these impossible choices at the local level of, do I serve the senior person who is in need of affordable housing, or do I serve that chronically homeless person? We could potentially get enough resources that we can shift out of that scarcity mindset and meet all the needs of the lowest income people in our communities.
And Joyce brought up in the chat the importance of exploring things like community land trusts and mixed income land trusts, again, as a way to kind of, she says balance out the housing scale, but I think to your point, Diane, it's meeting all the needs because we can meet them in lots of different ways in lots of different communities. There was a question Shannon put in the chat that Jacqueline, you actually touched on a little bit, but I want to see if anyone wants to expand on it. Is there an effort to pair CDCs and city land banks with BIPOC developers that are mission driven to create certified, healthy, zero energy, low income housing for underserved communities while offering training for local community members? Again, Jacqueline, I think you touched a little bit about some of the work that Enterprise has been doing in that area. Any other examples, any more to share?
No, but that sounds like very much like a unicorn, but you surely can do all of those things. People are looking at land trust models, Enterprises working with partners, I know for sure in California on such efforts. And I would say that Enterprise, if you haven't looked up, I'll make sure there's some information about green communities. We surely want healthy living places for folks. And so our green community criteria, which are in most state QAPs across the country, is some of the guiding light, not only for affordable housing, but for market rate. So all of those things are possible. And I think that what you're hearing from us today is there's no one right answer. People need housing they can afford. It could be home ownership. It could be rental housing. It could be community land trust. And we need to do all of the above because it's about meeting the people where they are at their juncture in, finding housing and what they can actually utilize or have resources to support. So yes, I think all of the above are possible.
Great. And I want to be aware of the time. I think we said we keep you to 11:50. So I just want to note two other things that are in the chat and then see if our panelists have any closing remarks or thoughts for us. Paulette brought up, it would be great to package funding or give additional points for projects that address affordable housing, but also some of the other issues like streets and bridges and retaining walls, environmental challenges like heat islands and brownfields and water runoff. So very good point there. And then Shannon had brought up Habitat for Humanity being a green energy provider through community solar. I'm not familiar with them doing that here in Philadelphia, but maybe that's something that they've been thinking about or doing in other places, and a very interesting idea. But I won't speak for them. I don't know if any of our Habitat friends are on the call and want to add anything in the chat on that. So with that, I want to just come back to our three excellent panelists, Diane, Robin, Jacqueline. Any closing remarks, words of inspiration for us as we think about seizing the moment, keeping the windows and doors open, wide open for as long as possible, and jamming everything through that we can?
I would just say to stay bold and don't. I think one of the things that a lot of us tend to do in the housing and homelessness field, one, we've been used to being in a defensive crouch for a really long time, and two, we tend to negotiate with ourselves before we even get to the planning table. I'd say now's the time to think really big and not feel limited by what's possible right now, because one, there is a lot that's possible in the immediate moment, and two, just looking back over the last year and how far we've come as a country on so many topics, racial justice and climate justice and housing justice. We don't know what will be possible right around the corner. So we shouldn't let that limit our imagination and what we're asking for now.
I'm going to jump in and say, take Diane's advice, think big, swing for the fences. Don't talk yourself out of it, and just shoot out the email before you do. And that's what I did with reparations. You know, it's so radical. Everyone's going to say, no, we can't do it locally. But really, I think we are in that space in history and time that we can imagine a new community, a new system, new structures, new policies. We can rewrite that. And it is time that we rewrite it, because we see that we're in, 400 plus years of Black resilience here in America, and still today we are racially oppressed in every area. So I would say continue to think big, collaborate, and lead in urgency. And those are my final words. And just thank you. It's been really great to be here with you all. Thank you for including me.
I mean, Diane and Robin, I mean, it's hard to follow you two. I agree with everything you said. But the one thing I would add, as we all go our separate ways and sit at our tables with these different groups, is one, make sure that someone that you're serving is included in the conversation, that they're informing your strategy. I think that's important. I think that people ignore that. I think it's important. The other thing I would say is, Robin hit on it. We're quick to use the data to point out the problems, slow to develop solutions that align with those same problems. So if everybody could begin to think about like, oh, I use this data point about this, or I use this data point about that, start to think about how that could be a part of a solution and move with urgency and boldness. And again, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I love Philly. I'm gonna come there sometime soon. It's great that you're learning from other parts of the country, but you guys got some great things going on there. And thanks for having this conversation today.
We welcome you all to come to Philly. We'll show you exactly where to eat. So just let us know when you're coming. I know I am much more fired up and inspired after the end of this panel to do the impossible and to push ourselves. That's where we got to start first, right? Pushing ourselves outside of our own comfort zones before we can push others. And so I want to thank you so much to our panelists, to Diane and Robin and Jacqueline, and to the audience for participation. I'm going to turn the mic over to the PACDC team to talk about next steps for those of you who want to take this conversation further to help vision and discuss what should or could be Philly's next big advocacy ask. So Pam, over to you.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Robin. This is incredible. I was sitting there, I was taking copious notes. I got like 45 white sticky notes, like, oh, yes, yes, we gotta do that. We gotta. This is, I know I'm charged up, and I know the people who were fortunate enough to hear you today are charged up too. So thank you so much. You guys are amazing. You do incredible work, and you're very, very busy people. So for you to share a bit of your time today with us, we really appreciate it. We know you gave up much to be here. We very much appreciate that. Thank you. Now, for those of you all who are, willing to stay with us, we are going to go take you into breakout rooms. You don't have to do anything, just sit and be